Today I'm going to talk to you about joint motions, agonist and antagonist pairs. I'm going to focus on the major joints. I'm not going to go into like fingers and toes. We're going to stick with shoulder, hip, knee, ankle, trunk, things like that. All right, first thing I'm going to do is go through the motions that are important to you. I mean, all of the motions at all of the joints are important, but I'm going to go focus on the joints that are going to help you, the joints and the motions that are going to help you to be successful in the class. We'll start with the shoulder. The first motion is shoulder flexion. Shoulder flexion entails moving the arms straight up. I have terrible shoulder flexions. Please don't judge me. So this would be shoulder flexion. This is shoulder extension. Okay. My shoulder has many degrees of freedom, it's called, but I also have shoulder abduction, shoulder adduction. I've got shoulder horizontal adduction and shoulder horizontal abduction. I've got shoulder internal rotation and internal rotation and shoulder external rotation. You might also see that as shoulder internal rotation or shoulder external rotation. The next one I'm going to do is the hip. So similar to the shoulder, which is a ball and socket joint, the hip is a ball and socket joint, so I have a lot of degrees of freedom. The ones that we're going to focus on right now are hip flexion. So this is a combination of hip and trunk flexion when I come down like this, because my spine is also flexing in addition to my hip. So this is hip flexion. This is hip extension. Alternatively, this is hip extension. So bringing my leg back would be extension. Bringing my leg forward to decrease this angle between my trunk and my femur is flexion. At the knee, I really have only got two that are of note, major ones, gross motions. I've got knee flexion and I've got knee extension. Flexion, extension. For the ankle, I've got a couple different ones. Well, the ones I'm going to focus on here are dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. So you might also see this as ankle flexion and ankle extension, but I'm going to call them dorsiflexion and plantar flexion here. This is dorsiflexion, bringing my toes toward my face, and this is plantar flexion, pointing my toes down, plantar, bottom of my foot, right? Towards the bottom of my foot. I've also got a few other accessory motions that will become important as we move into postural assessment. So I'm going to go over those right now. I've got neck flexion. I've got neck extension. I've got shoulder or scapular protraction and retraction. I've got neck protraction, neck retraction, thoracic kyphosis, and I've got lumbar lordosis. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about agonist and antagonist pairs. For this first one, I'm going to just use the example of my elbow. I've got elbow flexion and I've got elbow extension. In this class, this is a 200 level class. I'm not going to expect you to know anatomy, but I'm going to expect you to know motions. And because I expect you to know motions, that's how I want you to address the muscle groups. If you know the muscles and you want to use the muscles and you want to take it to the next level, that's cool with me. But if you don't feel comfortable with that material, this is going to be important. This is what I'm going to expect you to know. I'm not going to expect you to know that the bicep flexes the elbow. But what I do expect you to know is that the elbow flexors flex the elbow, right? So during elbow flexion, The elbow flexors are the agonist. They are the muscles causing the movement. When I use my agonist to cause elbow flexion, my antagonist, my triceps, or my elbow extensors are put on stretch. Okay, my antagonists are on stretch. So if I do elbow flexion, this is my agonist. My elbow flexors are my agonist. The antagonist for elbow flexion is the elbow extensors. When I put my elbow into flexion, I am stretching my elbow extensors. All right, so that is like a very generic way to go about this. Now I'm going to move into examples that you're actually going to use. I'm going to focus on shoulder, knee, and hip again. I'm going to start at the knee this time. So for the knee, if I put the knee into a flexion, the knee flexors are the agonists. They are they are contracting to put my knee into flexion, right? My knee extensors are the ones that do this, are the ones that are lengthening to allow me to achieve the knee flexion, right? So if I flex my knee, put my knee into flexion, my knee flexors are the agonists, my knee extensors are the antagonists, and the ones that I'm stretching here are the knee extensors. To put that in terms of muscles, my hamstrings flex my knee. When I put my knee into flexion, I stretch my quads. All right, so my next example is going to be the hip. I'm going to do a little bit of hip, let's say hip extension. My hip extensors move my hip into extension. My hip flexors lengthen to allow my hip to go into extension. In order to stretch my hip flexors, I need to put my hip into extension. Boom. Now, if I'm going to put that into words of like muscles, my glutes and my hamstrings put my hip into extension. I would use my glutes and my hips to put my hip into extension to stretch my hip flexors, my iliopsoas, and my rectus femoris. Now with the shoulder, this is shoulder flexion. I use my shoulder flexors to put my shoulder into flexion, right? Agonist. My shoulder extensors are put on stretch. My antagonists are put on stretch. So I use my agonist to put me into shoulder flexion, my shoulder flexors. My antagonists lengthen to allow me to go into shoulder flexion. So to stretch my shoulder extensors, I put my shoulder into flexion. I'm going to use muscles now. I use my anterior deltoids to put my shoulder into flexion. My lat lengthens to allow my shoulder to go into flexion. To stretch my lat, I would have to push my shoulder into more flexion. So these are some really basic examples of joint motions, and agonist-antagonist pairs to help you think about how you're going to select appropriate stretches for whatever your client needs.